Next up, we have a talk from a woman I admire a lot. She's been doing great things around the Europe startup scene. She's part of Connect Ventures. She's brilliant, and she will talk about how to find those core metrics that you need to focus on in your business so you can grow it. Please welcome Sitar Teli.
Hello. Thank you, Andra, for the very, very nice intro. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes? Good. Okay, so I'm going to talk about KPIs and core metrics. But before I do that, a little bit about myself. So I am American. I'm an engineer by education, mechanical engineering and material science. Studied it, never practiced it. Similar to the panelists before, I didn't want to work on bolts. And so instead I became a banker, which was a terrible choice. And then I redeemed myself by becoming a venture capitalist. So that's actually an improvement. So I was with Dowdy Hanson Tech Ventures, which is in London, for 7 years. And then last year, with a couple of partners, we started Connect Ventures. So I'm American, but I live in London, and I've been living in London for 8 years now, and investing in startups across Europe in that time. So last year, we started Connect Ventures, which is a seed VC firm based in London. We invest in companies in the UK, in Germany, Paris, Latvia, really anywhere where we find good opportunities. We have a focus on UK and Berlin because it's where we have a lot of investments and a lot of experience and a strong network. But we really look at companies everywhere. And we've been investing in consumer and B2B, both mobile and web, as well as SaaS companies that cross both. So I have quite a bit of experience on working with companies on their metrics and their KPIs, which is probably why Bogdan asked me to talk about it. But when he asked me to talk about it, I asked not to, because I thought KPIs are really interesting when you're building a company. But about an hour after lunch, hearing a 20-minute talk on KPIs probably leads to a very, very bored audience. But I'm going to try to make it as interesting as possible and as useful as possible. Because what I do believe is that KPIs are really important, and understanding which ones to measure and which ones not to measure, and when to measure them is critical for a company. So, when? When should you start measuring your KPIs? From the beginning. Yes and no. So it's from when you know what KPIs you need to measure, right? And that's a mistake a lot of people make, right? So a lot of founders I see start measuring everything, and measuring everything is about as useful as measuring nothing, right? So you have to know which KPIs to measure. So how do you know which ones to measure? What should your KPIs be aligned with? Anyone? Okay. So there's the ones you can influence and your customer base. So the ones you can influence is a bit of an easy answer, right? Because you're working on the things that you know you can change. But you can change some things that aren't useful for your company. So there's a lot of stuff you can change that maybe you shouldn't be spending your time on. In terms of your customer base, I'd say yes, but more generally, the KPIs you should focus on are the ones that are aligned with your goals as a company. And the goals are dependent on what stage you're at, and what product you're building, and what industry you're in. Which is why it's really hard to give a talk on KPIs in general. Because if you're building a SaaS company, the KPIs you look at are very different than if you're building a gaming company. So I'm going to try to do a kind of general, kind of abstract view of KPIs. But afterwards, if you have specific questions on the company you're building, we can talk in more detail about those. So KPIs are a really good dashboard, right? They help you figure out where you're going and if what you're doing is resulting in the goals that you want, right? So a really good KPI dashboard takes an input and gives you the output that you're trying to measure. And a bad KPI dashboard tells you a lot of stuff that you don't need, that doesn't help you achieve that goal. So with that in mind, when you look at something like this, I don't think it's actually very helpful, right? There is just a ton of numbers on that page, and I think most founders end up absolutely drowning in data. And it doesn't really help them understand their business. It doesn't really help them understand how their customers are using their product. So when you think about which KPIs to focus on, I think it's very important to look at what is a useful one and what is useless. Okay, useless is what are commonly known as vanity metrics. So vanity metrics are things like page views or visits or hits or even the number of visitors sometimes. It's like just a number that should, I mean, if that's not growing, you have much bigger problems. But even if it is growing, it doesn't actually mean anything for your business most of the time. Useful KPIs are user and goal-oriented. Okay, they focus on user actions, they focus on conversion rates, and they focus on engagement. And when you're trying to think about how do you figure out what areas you should be measuring, which ones you should be measuring, what are the useful ones, I think a framework is really helpful. So the framework that's probably most commonly used now is one by Dave McClure called R, which is part of his Pirate Metrics talk. Right? And R is just a way of saying that you have kind of 5 key areas that you should be focusing on. Right? Acquisition, activation, retention, referral, and eventually revenue. But that's not actually that helpful either, right? Because that's 5 different areas, each of which can lead to anywhere from 1 to a dozen KPIs. So in here, where do you think you should focus? Let's say you're clearly before product market fit. You're just put something out there. You've got people coming in and using it. What's the area where you should be focusing? Yeah. So retention and activation were the 2 answers. And I guess activation, yes, because otherwise you don't get anywhere. But once you've activated a user, the kind of core area where I encourage all of our companies to focus on is retention. And the reason is pretty simple. Okay? The retention is critical because retention is a function of your customer satisfaction. The goal for companies, right, is to build products that people want to use. And then ideally, they give you money in exchange for that product. But if you're not solving a problem for them, if you're not making them happy, if they're not satisfied with the product, you won't ever get to the end of that funnel. And so the core thing you need to focus on is to making sure your customers are satisfied. Are you really solving the problem for them? Are they coming back and using it? Does it make them happy if it's a game? Whatever it is, retention is the best place for most companies to focus on. Now that's the short answer. The long answer is it really depends on what stage you're at. You could be further along and have fantastic retention, but really poor monetization. In which case, you obviously need to focus at the end of the funnel and on the product areas that focus on getting money in exchange for your product. But for most people, the retention is the one area where you could really do a lot more. And it's the one area that actually tends to really change the value of your company. So if you can improve that measure, you just do a lot better. And one side note, so the problem with the R funnel is that it doesn't really talk about engagement. And retention is oftentimes conflated with engagement. They're not the same thing, right? Retention is someone coming back to your product or your site or your app. Engagement is how they interact with it. So someone can be coming back to your site, but not actually engaging with your product, or not engaging at the level where you want them to in order to move further down the funnel. So probably because RR doesn't sound as nice as R, engagement isn't in there, but I would encourage everyone to, after you've really got people coming back, to look at what their behavior is within your product and think about engagement metrics as well. But going back to R, what's another area to focus on after retention, or in addition to, I guess, in parallel to? Yeah. So I said referral and revenue, because that's kind of, that's where you actually get money, right? Yes, but I think a lot of people make a mistake of focusing on revenue too early, and they focus on it before they've optimized something else. But another mistake I see a lot of people make is that they focus on acquisition. They focus a lot on increasing the top of their funnel. And it's not a total mistake, right? In order to really measure your KPIs, in order to test hypotheses, you do have to have enough people coming in for the results to be statistically valid. That said, once you have even a baseline of people, I think the core area companies need to focus in is not on acquisition and not on revenue, but actually here. It's on the conversion points. Right? A lot of people focus on increasing the top of the funnel or increasing the bottom of the funnel. But actually the core thing you can do is actually increase the percentage of people that flow through your funnel. So if your acquisition to activation rate is 20%, focusing on getting that to 25% will yield far greater benefits than focusing on getting an additional person to pay you. Because just the sheer, if you keep your monetization rate at 1%, but you increase the number of people getting to that point, you will make more money. So always focus on conversion at the top of the funnel and then conversion all the way through. And most companies, the lever point that I found is between acquisition and activation, and then activation and retention. So it's really, really getting those numbers up. And it's not as easy as saying it should be 40% or it should be 20%. Ideally, it should be as high as you can make it without sacrificing other things. But at the same time, there may be an industry standard. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that you're increasing it as much as you can, right? So it's good to look at industry standards, but if you're at 5% and the industry standard is 40, that'll just depress you. But if you go from 5 to 10, that's an excellent result. And focusing on increasing that number is really the best thing you can do. So when you set the goal isn't just get to 40%. One, it's kind of a depressing goal because it takes a really long time to get there. But really the goal is to kind of constantly improve that rate rather than focusing on trying to get to some mythical industry number. Another area that I encourage all of our companies to focus on is using cohort analysis. So what a lot of people do is they use the average conversion rate. So they'll look at a month and say, our conversion rate was 20%. But in that month, they've probably made dozens of product changes. And the people that came in through week 1 had a very different experience than people came in through week 2 and week 3 and week 4. And you could expand that to months. You can also expand it to different marketing channels. So if people came in through marketing channel A, they may have a different experience or a different result than people that came in through marketing channel B. So a cohort analysis is when you group people based on a characteristic that they have in common. So it could be the time, it could be age, it could be sex, it could be the channel they came in from, it could be country. But when you look at people by cohort analysis and look at how they change over time, you'll learn a lot more about whether you're being effective on your product changes. And that's really the goal of KPIs, right? It's a dashboard. It's trying to help you achieve a goal. And in order to do that, you make product changes, or you make marketing changes, you make pricing changes, and then you look at the data to see if it was effective. But looking at data over averages or in large groups is almost never as effective as looking at it via cohorts. So if you look at this example, people that came in January, in their second month, they were about 20%, right? But if in October, people in the second month were at 53%, right? Now that's an awesome goal, but if you looked at that on an average, let's say your goal was to get to 50% engagement. Now, if you looked at that on average, you'd think you weren't hitting your goal, and you'd probably still be focusing on it. So you'd be probably wasting time and effort and resources trying to achieve a goal that you've already hit. Whereas if you looked at it on a cohort basis, you know you're there and you can move on to your next priority. So always look at cohort analysis. And they can also do the reverse, right? Averages can hide declines as well as increases, right? So a lot of times if you look at monetization over time, it looks like it's increasing, possibly because you have more people coming in. But if you actually looked at monetization rates over time, you might find that actually it's declining on a cohort basis. So always look at cohort analysis. It's one of the best tools you have when you're using KPIs to measure the effect of product changes. And then some other tips, because 20 minutes really is not enough time to talk about startup metrics, so I'll go pretty quickly. So good KPIs are linked to assumptions about your product. Right? One of the things you have to do is you have to sit down and say, okay, what are the KPIs I want to measure? But the KPIs you want to measure are linked to your goals, and the goal might be, okay, everyone's goal in the end is to build a profitable, sustainable business. At least it should be. But there are obviously many goals that come before that, right? And one of the goals you have is that, for example, you could say that the key to monetization is getting people to come back 3 times and leave a comment. I don't even care what your product is, but that's the goal, right? And if that's true, then you need to set up a KPI that's measuring that. And you need to validate it or falsify it. And you need to be honest with yourself about the result. And the good thing about KPIs is, they don't lie, right? So once you've set up a test and you're measuring the results, all you can do is look at the numbers and decide whether you were right or wrong. And then if you're wrong, you have to go back and come up with another hypothesis. But really good KPIs are not designed to make you feel good about your product. Good KPIs are meant to help you understand how people are using your product, what they're using it for, and whether the assumptions you have about those things are right or wrong. And then they can lead you to new assumptions, which you then, again, validate. Always look at rates or ratios. Absolute numbers are almost never helpful, right? If 1,000 people are paying for your product, that could be good or it could be terrible, it depends. If it's 1% of your base and you're trying to get to 10%, right, it's far more meaningful to know what percentage of your base it is. So always look at rates or ratios. You should know the industry standards, but again, focus on improvement. Right? Improvement of your KPIs is the goal, not trying to hit a number that other people have established as a standard. You could also find that as long as you focus on improvement, you blow away whatever industry standard there is, or that it just doesn't apply to your product for various reasons. So focus on improvement and getting better at that KPI rather than trying to achieve something that may or may not be relevant for you. And finally, understand your KPIs. If you can't explain the KPIs to people on your team or to your board members or your advisors, then they are bullshit. You can't understand them, neither will anyone else. Right? So there's a lot of, again, KPIs that people throw around that aren't actually helpful to helping you understand your business because you don't actually understand what they mean. So focus on ones that are understandable, or if there's one that's very useful and you don't understand it, do the work and try to understand it. And that's, I only have a minute left, but I think we have time for questions. So, and again, I'm here till tomorrow, so I'm always available for specific question on areas like SaaS or gaming, which is where a lot of our investments are.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Sitar. Let's give her a hand. Now, who has some questions?
Mulțumesc. Mă numesc Tibi Laszlo, de la Lateral sunt. I have one question because so far I heard about KPIs that are rather reactive, so they are measuring consequences. So I'm interested to find out about some KPIs that are proactive, like quality. So if I want to ensure a good retention or a good conversion rate, then I need to focus on quality that will ensure that consequence that I'm aiming for. Can you say a few words about that, please?
When you say quality, do you mean like customer happiness or customer satisfaction?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. It's about defining quality of a software. Let's look at that. Which, okay, can have many definitions, but that's something proactive that I could influence. So what I'm interested, if you can share a few words about how would you define and measure and set up KPIs for quality?
For software quality, so I don't actually design and develop software, so it's a little bit outside of my wheelhouse. But I mean, I would imagine you could look at things like the frequency of bug reports over a user session as a way of ensuring quality, if you believe that quality relates to conversion. But I think even more important than measuring the number of, so you can set up a test to measure the quality of your software, but I think then you have to set up additional tests to measure whether that affects the user behavior or whether they're able to withstand it. I would imagine something like that, it would affect it, but one thing you want to measure is the degree to which it is, because that'll influence how much time you spend fixing that problem.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Here.
Doesn't work. Yeah. I'm Denis Kwaka from Friends Advertising. You said we should measure the KPIs against industry standards, but most of the time they're secretive, sort of. How do we go on about that to find them out? And do you have some tips or resources?
Right. So I guess I wasn't that clear. I guess what I said is, so you should know the industry standards, but you shouldn't really measure yourself against them. What you should focus on is improving your own metrics. So you should know the standards if you can, but not focus on achieving them or trying to hit them. And then in terms of how to find them out, yes, it is hard. I know that there's some, like for example, on consumer social, there are just some common standards in terms of active rates and in terms of who creates versus consumes. The problem is a lot of those are just what people say. And when you actually look at applications and you measure them, you oftentimes get very different numbers. So the answer is I don't know where to find them. I know like in gaming, you can find numbers on ARPUs and conversion rates and activation and re-engagement and day 3 retention and day 7 retention. And you might know what a game is doing, but oftentimes you kind of have to get some inside knowledge. And so you have to know people. But even then, you can talk to one gaming company and they'll give you an answer. You talk to another gaming company and they'll give you a different answer. And it's because there isn't really a standard, which is again why I think it should be aligned with your goals, not with industry standards, right? Because if your goal is to be a profitable, independent company, you know what you need to do to achieve that. And you know how you have to align your conversion rates to get to that point. I think focusing on that rather than what another company might be doing is far more beneficial.
Thank you. One last question. In the back. Yes, please.
I'm Marius. Would you please have share with us some tips or advice on how to increase referral rates? And obviously this depends from product to product, but maybe there are some stuff that you've seen that usually works in some categories. Thanks.
Referral rates, you mean like how do you get someone using your product to refer someone else, yeah?
Yeah.
Build good products is the best way to get good referral rates. That's always my answer to it. Whenever we've got some companies where they just say, our users are not recommending it to other users, and I don't try to pull any punches with that. I almost always the answer is their product is just not there yet. It's just not that good. It's just not that great an experience. And people will recommend things that they find to be really useful, absolutely solves a problem, or is just delightful in some way. And I think if you're not doing one of those three things, it's going to be very hard for you to get referrals. Even if you get some money from your users, it's just not enough for them to actually actively, proactively go out to people and say it. That said, you can make it easier for people to refer you, right? So there are points at which in the product flow where you should probably be asking people to share it with a friend. I generally recommend that those points are when you think the user is happiest with your product, right? So if you're an e-commerce company, it's probably when they've received the package, not when they've paid for it. So a lot of people, even Amazon, will say, right when you buy a product, it'll say share. And I don't know why they do that, because I just bought something. I just spent money. I don't know why I want to brag about that. But when I receive something, I'm oftentimes very happy about it. And that's usually the best point for me to actually want to share the experience, right? If you're a video site and someone watches the video and they watch it twice or 3 times, which people often do, or a music site, they clearly really like that song or that piece of content. That would be a good time to ask them. If it's after every single piece of content, maybe not, right? So I always try to say, find the point where your customer is happiest with your product or your user is happiest with your product, and that's the point at which you should be asking them to share it with other people.
Super. Thank you so much, Sitar. That will be all. Thank you so much.